Hello, this is Steve Dinham. I'm Emeritus Professor of Education at the University of Melbourne Graduate School of Education. My background is in high school teaching in New South Wales government schools and later worked in universities. My main area of interest now is instructional leadership, and my latest book is called Leading, Learning and Teaching, and I gave a highlights package of that over a couple of days to one of the groups in Orbis earlier this year. I've been asked to give a short presentation of my area of interest relevant to the current situation, which is a great movement towards off-school, off-campus education at all levels of education. So one of the key things I think we need to start with is clarifying what our vision is in this period. I think it's more than just trying to transfer what we're doing to that setting. There are opportunities involved, and we need to possibly learn from those when things get back to normal, which I hope won't be too long. So what's our vision? What are we trying to achieve? How are we going to achieve it? What data do we need? What resources do we need to achieve those outcomes? One of the key things that I stress in the work that I do is the need for educators to be critical consumers of research. And this means to do the research, to talk to people who've used a particular thing, to evaluate both what we're currently using or doing and what these new things possibly offer us. Now, at the moment, with such a shift to online learning, there are many vested interests. There are many altruistic people who are attempting to assist us in that process. So we really need to be very, very mindful of what we do, the cost-benefit analysis of a particular approach. Now, let's begin with some really basic principles that have certainly come out in my research over many years. The best teachers, faculties, schools, even systems, you could argue, know their students in two ways. They know each and every student as a learner and as a person. Both of these things are important. We know them as a learner through assessment, and that just means more than marks and grades on tests, for example. It's anecdotal, it's observational. We know where their learning has been, we know where it is at the current time in comparison with what our expectations are for that particular group, for example, and we know what we need to do to move their learning forward. So that knowing them as a learner is quite important, but we also need to know them as a person. We know, for example, that the teacher-student relationship has a large effect on student learning. It's really quite important, and we underestimate the effects that we have on students in some ways. Now, when I talk to people in schools across Australia and around the world, in fact, I've done this in Finland and I've done it in Germany too, and I ask students, what do you want from schooling? What do you want from your teachers? And their responses can be summarised in two words: care and fair. Now, if we look at the care part, there are probably three aspects to this. There's the personal care and safety and well-being. They want to be looked after. They don't want to be put in danger. They certainly don't want to be emotionally or any other way compromised or affected. They also, though, as well as that personal care and safety, well-being, they also want to know that their learning is important and that it's being addressed. So there's an academic aspect to care as well, and there's also a social aspect, and this is quite important when we talk about diversity and the different sorts of people coming to schools. So we know them as a learner through assessment broadly defined, and we know them as a person. And as part of that, they know that we care for them and that we also treat them fairly. The fairly part is important too. No discrimination, no stereotyping, no low expectations for a certain group of people. Now, how we meet those needs in the current context is quite significant. We need to establish in any learning situation, but particularly here, the learning needs of our students. Where are the deficiencies? Where do we need to learn more ourselves in many ways and to address those learning needs? So we need to work out how to determine those needs. Do we do it from previous assessment? Do we do it through talking to them? Do we do it through some form of measurement? So what are their learning needs in this particular context? The second point is really important. What are the learning needs of our staff, the people who are working with these students? Where are the gaps in their knowledge and expertise? And some of it might be relevant to a particular topic or subject, but some's more generally applicable in terms of these new approaches that we are using with these students. We also need to include the parents, caregivers, the learning partners in this exercise. What are their needs? In my experience, most parents, if they are shown how to do it and have the opportunity, are very, very keen to assist in the learning of their children. But if they don't know what they're supposed to be doing, that can be problematic. So we need to actually really look at communication in this current context. How do we communicate not just with the students, but with their parents and caregivers and the learning partners in the exercise? And then what's that mean as a result? Following from that, we need to have really clear expectations for all the parties concerned. We need, for example, agreement on the learning contract, if you like, what's required of the student. This is in terms of both synchronous and asynchronous activities. I mean, when are they supposed to be online with everybody else and participating? What are the expectations in terms of their access to us, for example? I mean, is it okay to get an email at 9:30 at night or 7 in the morning, or what boundaries do we put around that? We also need to have some sort of agreement on things like screen time, which can be excessive and can be deleterious in some cases. So what's the balance between the online or the screen time learning and the offline learning, which might come through using other activities or resources? As part of that, we need to think very, very clearly about feedback, and in fact the obligations of all parties here. In terms of leaders in schools, and in this case out of schools, what are some of the key things here? Well, we need to look at the curriculum content we're hoping to cover. We almost need to map this out with milestones and mastery, and it might be different to what occurs in the classroom. One of the things we know about students is that they tend to learn at different rates, and as a result we need to accommodate that. We can't go too quickly, we can't go too slowly. We still need to try and personalise the learning in this particular case. Now, as well as that curriculum planning, we need planning around evaluation and assessment. We need to share the expertise and workload of our teachers, and we need frequent debriefing. I'd suggest much more frequent than we have in normal day-to-day teaching. How are things going? What's working? What's not working? And how we can assist each other to actually share the where, if you like. It's about building an online community of learners, and we need to look at the known techniques to assist in that, the technology, the approaches. As I said, it's part of being a critical consumer of research. One of the key things we need to do, though, is we need to connect with each student, and in fact each teacher, every day if we can possibly do it. They need to feel connected, they need to feel engaged, their needs need to be met, and they need to be contributing to the overall teaching situation. So that's a big aim, but that care and fair really requires that in this particular case. It may be a paradox that some students get more personal contact in this situation than they might in the average classroom, where they're largely, passive and not really coming to our attention for whatever reasons. In terms of managing the whole thing, it's a new work day, it's a new work way, and we need to think that through. And I think the key thing, or the two key things probably, one's collaboration and one's professional learning. And collaboration between student and student, student and teacher, teacher and teacher, teacher and parents, student and parents, and so it goes. Collaboration, communication, I think is absolutely the key to this. And we also need to look after the welfare of our teachers. Just as we would respond to our students, we need to look after their welfare and how they're coping in this situation, which is different. It doesn't mean in the long term that we're going to adopt this method permanently, because there are still very, very important functions of schools in terms of structure and socialisation and so forth, interacting with other people. One of the key things here is feedback to and from students. The feedback to students, In my experience over quite a long period of time, students need answers to 4 questions. The first question is, what can I do at the present moment, not forever? We're not talking about people who can or can't do something forever. That's entity thinking, and we want to avoid that. We want to encourage a growth mindset where people can see that it's possible to improve. So what are they doing at the current moment in their learning process? What can't they do at the present time? The second related point is, how does their performance relate to the group, our expectations for that particular subject and so forth? How does their work compare with that of others, in other words? Now, if we stop there, in terms of what they know, what they don't know or can do, and how their work compares with others, if we just stop there, it's pure assessment. The really important feedback, the really important part of feedback is, how can I do better? And we need to make sure in our interactions with students that not only do we show them how they're going, but we show them how to do better, how to improve. If they don't get that, then as I said, it's essentially assessment. And on the subject of assessment, I think there's a general thing in education. We over-assess and under-feedback. We have too many superficial tasks, activities where we don't really provide a foundation, we don't really connect with previous learning, we don't really adequately assess or provide feedback. So our feedback needs to be focused, it needs to be future related, it needs to be positive, but also it needs to communicate the areas where students need to improve. Now, as part of that, we need regular reporting to parents as well, but also we need to utilise the students themselves, student voice in other words. And student voice, I think this provides an opportunity to enhance that, particularly the one-to-one. We know that one-to-one conversations or conferences between teachers and students are very, very powerful, but often in the day-to-day of the classroom we don't have the opportunity to do that. So here's an opportunity, at least for a few minutes a day anyway, possibly to have that one-to-one feedback. Donald McIntyre at Cambridge some years ago and colleagues did some work on feedback from students, or student voice if you like, and they found that where students very rarely have the opportunity to provide feedback, and often it's not acted upon, then that feedback tends to be negative, critical, unhelpful. If on the other hand students have a regular opportunity to provide feedback on their learning, on the teaching, on the school that they attend, if they have regular opportunities to provide feedback and they see it acted upon, that's quite important, then the feedback is usually positive, helpful, constructive. So I think this provides an opportunity for the one-to-one conferencing type idea and for enhancing our use of student feedback. How are they finding the experience? What are the issues they're struggling with? What are the benefits that they've encountered in this particular process? And as part of this, students monitoring their own learning against some sort of rubric or some sort of mastery is quite important too. If they can see themselves getting better, even if it's baby steps, they will feel better about themselves. It will feed into greater growth in learning, it will feed into self-efficacy and self-concept. If on the other hand they don't get that feedback, they can become frustrated, they can quit due to lack of progress. That's all going to be quite important. So helping them monitor their own learning and seeing themselves improving is really very, very important. It's a powerful motivator. We want intrinsic motivation as much as possible. We want people who want to learn, want to improve, rather than people who feel they have to because of some external force. Now, in all of this progress, we need to monitor how we're going ourselves. I think we need more frequent teacher-to-teacher interaction, I've mentioned earlier, than maybe we have at the present time. We need needs analysis. We need to evaluate, modify what we're doing in the light of the data that we're producing as we go. So there's a lot more, I think, in terms of online management. One of the things we might need to look at is the issue of assessment using video. In other words, students demonstrating, explaining, rather than sort of written tasks and so on, which we still might have. But this idea of actually being able to have video assessment with peers having input and observing, I think would be very, very useful indeed. How might we build upon this experience? Because hopefully it's not going to go on forever. I think the focus on every student as a learner and a person, the care and care, the connection, I think we need to strengthen and maintain that when we get back to normal. I think the greater collaboration that we'll see amongst educators in planning, teaching, assessment, feedback, evaluation, I think that greater collaboration that's required now, I think that can be carried forward too. I think the notion of deeper, richer learning and tasks and activities rather than over-assessing with lots of busy work is something that we really need to look at. I think the self-assessment on how students are going, getting them to think about what's behind the purpose of their learning and how they're going and how they're improving, I think is all very, very useful there. I think a positive, if it continues, will be the greater communication with parents and caregivers and so forth that's going to be required in this exercise. I think engendering the sense of belonging when you're fragmented and you're disconnected in some ways from the people you see on a day-to-day basis, that greater sense of belonging or engagement, it might be that there's some important lessons there for when we get back to normal. I think something that's going to be a really positive outcome of this, and I've seen evidence already, is a greater appreciation in both senses of the word, I should say, by parents in the general community of teachers' work and the value of that work and what they do. So a greater appreciation within the community, I think, would be a very welcome outcome of all of this. Let me finish by a bit of a sporting analogy, because it's Australia and there's not much sport at the moment, so we'll talk about sport. There's a saying in boxing, and I'm not an advocate for boxing, I think it's brutal and barbaric, but there is an argument in boxing that says if you want to judge a person's character, what they're made of, watch them when they're losing, not when they're winning. In other words, how do they handle adversity, pressure, complexity? How do they handle that situation of stress? Now, educators across the world at the moment are being put under a lot of stress, and the role has become a lot more complex in many ways. And it's frightening in many ways. I mean, we're talking literally life and death here. And I think what's happened is that the true commitment and value of educators has really come to the fore, along with other people in our community who perform essential functions, from the most menial to the most complex. So I hope in all of this, that growing sense of appreciation and valuing comes through. For each of you observing this, my endorsement, congratulations, affirmation for what you're trying to do. It's most important. Education must go on. It will look different this particular period of time in terms of, for example, some of our examinations we have and some of the reporting that we have. But we need to look after our students, and we need to look after ourselves, and we need to look after each other. So my best wishes.